The text arrived at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, and Margaret Chen read it 4 times before her phone slipped from her fingers and landed face down on the kitchen floor. "You weren't invited to dinner, Mom. My wife doesn't want you there." 9 words. 11, if you counted the contraction. 32 years of motherhood, the 3 a.m. feedings, the little league games in the rain, the college tuition she'd paid by working double shifts at the hospital, and her son Daniel had reduced all of it to 11 words sent from across town while she was reheating leftover soup. She didn't cry. That surprised her. She'd always been the type to cry at commercials, at graduation ceremonies, at the sight of baby shoes in thrift store windows. But standing in her kitchen with the linoleum cold beneath her bare feet and the soup beginning to bubble over on the stove, Margaret Chen felt nothing but a vast, spreading stillness. The kind that comes not from peace, but from something breaking so completely that the broken pieces no longer have edges sharp enough to hurt. She turned off the burner. She picked up her phone. She set it on the counter face up and made herself look at the message one more time, just to confirm she hadn't misread it, hadn't invented some wound that didn't exist. She hadn't. Daniel Chen had been, by every measure Margaret had access to, a good son. Not a perfect son, she'd never wanted that, never believed in it, but a good one. He called on Sundays. He remembered her birthday with cards that came in the actual mail, not just text messages. When her husband, his father, had died 4 years ago from the stroke that took him between one heartbeat and the next, Daniel had been the one to hold her hand in the hospital hallway while the doctor spoke words that turned the world gray. He'd handled the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the impossible bureaucracy of death, while Margaret sat in her living room staring at the chair where Robert had always sat and trying to remember how to breathe. That was the Daniel she knew. The Daniel who'd sent that text was someone she was only beginning to understand. His name was still Daniel Robert Chen, named for his father's middle name, a fact that Robert had pretended embarrassed him but which Margaret had caught him bragging about at least a dozen times. But in the 3 years since he'd married Vivienne, something had shifted. Slowly at first, the way a house settles, almost imperceptibly, until one day you notice a crack in the wall and realize it's been growing for years. The Sunday calls grew shorter. The birthday cards stopped coming by mail and arrived instead as texts, warmer than nothing, colder than before. Family dinners that had once been sprawling, loud affairs with Margaret's sister and her husband and the cousins all crammed around a table too small for everyone became smaller, then smaller still, until the invitations simply stopped. Margaret had told herself it was normal. Newlyweds needed space. Wives needed to establish their own traditions, their own rhythms. Margaret herself had navigated the complicated geography of in-law relationships. Robert's mother had been a difficult woman who'd never fully believed Margaret was good enough for her son, and Margaret had sworn, silently and solemnly, that she would never make her own children feel that way about their choices. So she gave space. She didn't drop by unannounced. She didn't offer opinions on how they decorated the apartment or what they named their dog or how often they ate takeout versus cooking at home. She bit her tongue when Vivienne made comments at the few dinners. They did share small comments, the kind that could always be explained away as jokes, as misunderstandings, as Margaret being too sensitive. Daniel always says his mom is the type who gets attached. Vivienne had said that once, early on, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Daniel had laughed, and Margaret had smiled and said nothing because she was a guest in their home, and she would not be the difficult mother-in-law. She would not. She had given so much space that apparently she'd given herself right out of her son's life. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the bed she'd shared with Robert for 31 years and stared at the ceiling and had a conversation with him in her head, the way she still did sometimes, the way grief teaches you to do when the person who knew you best is simply gone. "What do I do?" she asked him. She could almost hear him. Robert had been a quiet man, careful with words, A civil engineer who believed that if something wasn't built on a solid foundation, it would eventually fall, and that this was true of bridges and marriages and apologies alike. You find out what's actually happening, he would have said. Before you react, before you decide anything, you find out what you're actually dealing with. Margaret turned onto her side and looked at the empty pillow beside her. And if it's what it looks like, she asked. Robert's imagined voice was quiet for a long moment. Then you decide what you're worth. She called Daniel the next morning. He answered on the third ring, which told her he'd considered not answering at all. Mom, his voice was careful, neutral in the way that isn't natural, that has to be constructed. I got your text, she said. She decided sometime around 3 a.m. that she would not perform hurt. She would not cry or plead or guilt him. She would simply speak plainly and see what he did with plain speech. I'd like to understand. A pause, she could hear him breathing. In the background, a door closed, Vivienne leaving the room or entering it. Margaret couldn't tell which. Vivienne is going through a difficult time, Daniel said. She needs the holidays to be, she needs things to be calm, low stress. I see, Margaret kept her voice even, and my presence is stressful. Mom, I'm not accusing you of anything, Daniel. I'm asking a question. Am I the source of stress, or is Vivienne going through something that's making everything feel like a lot? Another pause, longer this time. Both, he finally said, and she could hear that it cost him something to admit it. She feels like, she says, you never really accepted her, that you always made her feel like she wasn't good enough. Margaret sat with that. She set it down on the table of her mind and looked at it from all sides the way Robert would have examined a structure, checking for where the load was being carried, where the weak points were. Can you give me an example? She asked. A specific moment when I made her feel that way. Silence. Daniel, I'm not asking to argue. I'm asking because if I've done something to hurt her, I want to understand what it was. I don't have a memory of it, and that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I could be wrong about how something landed. But I need more than a general feeling. But she says you looked at her differently at Dad's funeral. Of all the things Margaret had expected, it wasn't that. At your father's funeral, she repeated slowly. She felt like you were, she said you seemed cold to her, like you were focused on everyone except her. The grief that moved through Margaret then was complicated, layered, almost impossible to name. Because yes, she had been focused on other people at Robert's funeral. She had been greeting 400 people who'd come to pay their respects to a man who'd spent 40 years building things that lasted. She had been standing at his casket and making decisions about where the flowers should go and whether the caterers had enough and who needed to be called because they hadn't heard. She had been surviving the worst day of her life and apparently also failing, simultaneously, to make her daughter-in-law feel sufficiently included. I see, she said again. Her voice stayed level through what she estimated was an extraordinary act of will. I know the timing is. I'd like to propose something, Margaret said. I'd like to meet with Vivienne, just the two of us. No pressure, no agenda, coffee, somewhere neutral. If she has things she needs to say to me, I'll listen. If there are ways I've hurt her without realizing it, I want to know. And if after that conversation she still doesn't want me at dinner, then I'll accept that. But I'm not willing to be quietly excluded without at least being given the chance to understand why. Silence again, but a different quality of silence this time, less like a wall, more like a door that hadn't decided yet whether it was locked. I'll ask her, Daniel said. Vivienne agreed. Margaret suspected this surprised Daniel, though he didn't say so. They met at a small cafe 3 weeks later, neutral ground, as Margaret had requested, a place that belonged to neither of them. Vivienne was already there when Margaret arrived, which Margaret noted without assigning meaning to it. She was 5 minutes early, so Vivienne had been very early indeed. The younger woman sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Margaret noticed, for the first time perhaps because she was actually looking, how tired she seemed. The careful exterior, the polished hair, the expensive coat, couldn't quite conceal the shadows under her eyes or the way her shoulders sat too high, too tense, the posture of someone braced for impact. Margaret sat down across from her and said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Vivienne looked at her with an expression that cycled rapidly through suspicion, surprise, and something that might have been relief before it settled back into caution. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "Why wouldn't I?" "Because," Vivienne stopped, looked at the table. "Because I wasn't kind to you. The text Daniel sent, that was my doing. I told him what to write." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know. He didn't tell me, but I know my son's voice, and that wasn't it." Something shifted in Vivienne's face, a small fracture in the careful surface. "I owe you an apology," Vivienne said. She seemed to be dragging the words up from somewhere deep and reluctant. The last year has been very hard. I have anxiety, diagnosed, medicated, the whole thing. And sometimes when I'm in a bad period, I look for things I can control. She stopped again. Her hands tightened around the cup. "I think I made Daniel choose, not directly. But I made it a thing where he was either on my side or yours, and there was no version where he could love us both. And that wasn't fair to either of you." The cafe moved around them, coffee machines hissing, other conversations. A child at the next table negotiating with her mother about something to do with a muffin. And Margaret looked at this young woman who had hurt her and saw, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that Vivienne was also someone who'd been hurt. Not by Margaret specifically, or not only, but hurt by something older, deeper, something that had come into her marriage already lodged in her chest like a splinter too deep to reach. "Why does my presence feel threatening to you?" Margaret asked, not unkindly, like a woman who genuinely wanted to understand the architecture of a problem. Vivienne's eyes filled and she looked almost angry about it, the way people do when they cry in front of someone they've been trying to hate. "My own mother left when I was 9, she said. I don't know how mothers are supposed to work. And Daniel loves you so much. The way he talks about you. I thought if he had you, he didn't need me the same way. I thought I had to compete." The silence that followed wasn't empty. "Vivienne," Margaret said carefully, "I have spent 3 years trying very hard not to be the difficult mother-in-law. I've stayed back because I thought you needed space. I've bit my tongue because I didn't want you to feel criticized. None of that was coldness. It was," she paused, "because honesty deserved precision. It was me not knowing how to be what you needed because you never told me what that was. And I suppose I never asked." "I never asked either." "No." They sat with that shared failure for a moment, examining it without drama. "I'd like to try again," Margaret said. "I'd like to have coffee with you again, not because you owe me anything and not to fix everything at once, but because I think we got started on wrong footing and I don't think either of us actually wants it to stay this way." Vivienne wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture so unguarded, so unlike her careful public self, that Margaret felt a sudden and unexpected rush of tenderness. "Daniel is going to be shocked," Vivienne said. "Good," said Margaret. "He needs to know that the women in his life are capable of handling their own problems without him in the middle." Vivienne laughed, a real laugh startled out of her, the kind you can't manufacture. It changed her face entirely. The dinner happened 5 weeks later. Not the original dinner, the one Margaret hadn't been invited to, that had come and gone, whatever it was, some work thing of Vivienne's that Margaret genuinely hadn't needed to be part of. No, this was a different dinner, one that Vivienne had called Margaret specifically to arrange. Sunday evening, their apartment, just the 3 of them. Margaret brought flowers because she always brought something and flowers seemed safe, and also wine because the occasion felt like it warranted something stronger than flowers alone. Daniel opened the door, and the look on his face when he saw her, that mix of hope and wariness, and the particular vulnerability of a son who loves both his mother and his wife, and has been slowly hollowed out by the impossibility of loving both, broke her heart, and also healed something in it simultaneously. "Mom," his voice came out rougher than she thought he intended. "Hi, baby," she said, because he was 34 years old and she was still his mother and some things didn't change. She reached up and put her hand on his cheek for just a moment, the gesture she'd made 10,000 times, in hospitals and airports and doorways, and watched his eyes go bright and then steady. He stood back and let her in. The apartment smelled like garlic and rosemary, and Vivienne appeared from the kitchen with flour on her forearms, and an expression of such determined optimism that Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm making your pot roast," Vivienne said. "Daniel described it. I don't know if I got it right." "You called my mother," Daniel said, and there was something between accusation and wonder in his voice. "Last week," Vivienne confirmed. "She told me the recipe." He looked between them, his wife in flour, his mother in the doorway, and Margaret watched her son try to find the narrative, try to locate himself in a story whose shape had just changed. "You two talked," he said. "We talk now," Margaret said simply. "Is that all right?" Daniel opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at Vivienne, who raised her floury arms in a small shrug. "You always said you wanted us to get along," Vivienne said. "I did," he said. "I just thought." "That we'd make you mediate it?" Margaret asked mildly. He had the decency to look somewhat abashed. "The pot roast is going to burn," Vivienne said, already retreating to the kitchen, "and then nobody gets anything." Daniel turned back to his mother. In the kitchen, something sizzled, and Vivienne made a small sound of alarm and then a sound of recovery. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly. "The text, that wasn't, I shouldn't have sent it." "No," Margaret agreed. "You shouldn't have, but I understand why you did, and I understand what you were trying to protect, even if the method was wrong." She put her hand on his arm. "You're a good man, Daniel. You just got caught between two people who should have been talking to each other instead of managing you." He exhaled a long, unsteady breath, like a man setting down something heavy. "Dad would have sorted this out faster," he said. "Your father would have built a literal bridge," Margaret said. "He once made a scale diagram of a family argument. Did I ever tell you that?" Daniel blinked. "No." "Ask me later. It's a very good story." She patted his arm and moved toward the kitchen. "Now go open that wine before Vivienne realizes she's overcooking the carrots." The pot roast was not quite right. Margaret's had a particular richness that came from a technique she'd developed over 2 decades, and Vivienne had made it with care and good intentions, but without the accumulated knowledge. And it was also, without question, one of the best meals Margaret had eaten in years. Not because of the food. Because Daniel sat at the head of the table with his shoulders finally down, tension draining from him like water from a filled glass tilted slowly level. Because Vivienne told a story about her colleague's calamitous attempt at making croissants that made all 3 of them laugh until Margaret's eyes watered. Because somewhere in the second glass of wine, when the conversation had found its ease, Vivienne leaned over and asked, quietly, almost shyly, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed, whether Margaret had any pictures of Daniel as a baby. Margaret looked at her son, who looked at his wife, and something passed between them that Margaret wasn't meant to fully understand, some private reckoning, some quiet mutual arrival. "I have albums," Margaret said, "embarrassing ones." "I want to see all of them," Vivienne said. "No, you don't," Daniel said. "I absolutely do," said Vivienne, and she was smiling at Margaret when she said it, really smiling, and Margaret smiled back. And there it was, not reconciliation exactly, because reconciliation implies returning to what was, and what was had never been right to begin with. Something new then, something built fresh on foundation that was still settling, would go on settling, but was solid enough to build on. Later at the door with her coat on and the empty wine bottle tucked under her arm because Vivienne had insisted she take it for recycling, and the gesture had been so domestic, so casually familial, That it had taken Margaret off guard, Daniel hugged her. Held on. "Same time next week," he said into her hair. She pulled back and looked at him. Robert's nose, her mother's eyes. 34 years of a person she'd made and shaped and then released into the world and loved from the careful distance he'd needed. "I'll bring dessert," she said. She walked to her car in the quiet Sunday evening. The sky, that particular shade of deep blue that comes just after the last of the light, is gone, and she sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about the text, 11 words that had felt like a door slamming. She thought about Vivienne's flowery arms and Daniel's unsteady exhale, and the pot roast that wasn't quite right and was completely perfect. She thought about Robert and what he would have said. "What are you worth?" he would have asked her. She started the car. She knew the answer now. Some families are born. Some are built, slowly, meal by meal, coffee by coffee, one honest conversation at a time. The strongest structures are rarely the ones raised without difficulty. They're the ones that cracked and were examined and were carefully, deliberately repaired.